At 4ZZZ, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we broadcast. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the Turrbal and Jagera people. We acknowledge that their sovereignty over this land was never ceded.
And we stand in solidarity with them.
Tranzmission on 4ZZZ, amplifying the trans and gender diverse community of Meanjin, Brisbane and beyond. Hello, you're listening to Tranzmission, both on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM and also on your podcast streaming service that you are listening to right now, I assume. You're listening to a very special, podcast-only episode of Tranzmission, where I have myself, Ez, he, him, have an interview with the incredible Professor Sandy O'Sullivan, who is a Wiradjuri scholar, community advocate, and senior academic leader whose work sits at the intersection of Indigenous sovereignty, gender diversity, and social justice. A transgender, non-binary academic, they have spent decades challenging colonial systems in education and public life while centering First Nations voices, knowledge, and lived experience. Professor O'Sullivan is widely respected for their leadership, truth-telling, and deep commitment to solidarity and community care. I am so excited to introduce this interview. I was very much looking forward to broadcasting it live. However, a far more important broadcast was necessary, as our broadcast now falls on a Monday, which also happens to be quite a lot of public holidays. And one of the public holidays that I don't really think should be a public holiday is Invasion Day, which is the 26th of January every year. And we dedicated our show to the First Nations community of 4ZZZ so that they could broadcast the speeches live from Invasion Day in Queen's Garden. And you can listen back to that broadcast if you'd like. Head to the 4ZZZ website, 4ZZZ.org.au, go to the Tranzmission episode from last week, and you'll listen to 2 hours of speeches from the protest, of which myself and a number of the Tranzmission crew were present. Please give it a listen. We like to stand in solidarity with First Nations community, and actually, more so than anything, we should centre their knowledge. I believe that the conversations that I have had with Sandy, which I'm very excited to share with you shortly, will highlight some of those important aspects of transness and indigeneity and what that all means, what that doesn't mean. It was a very full-on conversation. It was fantastic. And if you've heard Professor Sandy before, you may have heard them on shows like Radio Reversal, which is a show that I like to plug right now because it is an absolutely fantastic 4ZZZ broadcast, of which you can catch Radio Reversal every Thursday morning from 9 a.m. And you can also listen to their podcast as well. You can head to the Radio Reversal socials to check it all out. Yeah. Let's head straight into our chat with Professor Sandy. I hope you enjoy this special podcast episode. Nice to meet you officially, finally. Can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what connects you to both transgender and First Nations communities?
Yeah, sure. It's a lot, as it is for all of us, I think, to try and think about our connection back to the community that we're a part of. But I'm a Wiradjuri person. I'm trans, non-binary, and I am, as a Wiradjuri person, I'm very connected to my own community, but I'm also connected more broadly to First Nations communities. I'm joining you from Darabnura, and I grew up in various different countries around so-called Australia. But yeah, the work I do, is a part of that connection back to my community. And so I sort of see it as a bit inextricable. I know you're going to ask some more around that, but it's really funny. It's always about challenging the colonial project of gender and sexuality and everything else. And it sort of has to be that, it has to be that because I work across the public imaginary. People often find that a little bit tricky to understand, but we live across the public imaginary. Like we live in people's minds and ideas, whether it's our families and friends that love us, whether it's people who are like less fond of us. We live in those spaces, and so a lot of what I do is understand a little bit more about that, but also that's a lot of what I do as a person as well. So yeah, I'm nearly 60, so in a couple of months I'll be 60, and so I've been around for a long time, and I come from a very large family. I see a very strong connection to my family and to my ancestors, and that becomes a really important motivator for me, but also whole of community. I don't even mean but, I just mean and, whole of community. So what do I work in two different centres, one of which is called the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures, and the other one is the Centre of Critical Indigenous Studies, both at Macquarie. And so one is a research arm and the other is our whole of institution work. And they're all in service of connecting people up. And I've worked largely across museums and in cultural spaces. I do a lot of work in art, and I just came off a very large project that was looking at queer Indigenous art making, but not art making, actually, artists and the contribution that they have and that they make.
Wow, sounds like you're busy.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be very challenging to navigate a world in the imaginary when you're thinking. It makes me think about labels and how labels are useful, but not everything. And why is it important to be having conversations right now about solidarity between trans communities and First Nations people, do you think?
I think it's always been important. I don't think it's more or less important. I think, first of all, as someone who's Aboriginal and trans, I don't see the distinction. I mean, there isn't a distinction, obviously, for me and my body and, for me and my community. But I think this is part of the silos that people set up. It's the Colonial project is containers. It sets up containers that people belong in or they don't. So part of what we say, I think, as trans people often is that, we're a part of the broader community. But I think there's still this sense of a distinction by others, and sometimes by ourselves, because it's important for identity and for understanding. But it also creates distance. First Nations communities are not trying to create distance from their relatives. I don't mean individuals can be awful, of course, but communities at large are not doing that. They're not trying to find a way to push people out. And communities at large arguably are not doing that either, but we're seeing some really bad actors who are using some of the same tactics that are used for dismissing sovereignty and dismissing, Indigenous rights on trans people, So I don't equate the two, there's not two for me, they're one, but I don't equate the idea of these set up external groupings. There's no pan-indigeneity. We're not all the same, We're different people from different communities, but we also have our differences within our communities. But we're forced into this kind of solidarity with ourselves that is sometimes kind of tricky, and it's the same for trans people. It's the same for any group that has an identified moniker.
We're not monolithic,
No, we're not monolithic. And I think part of that is that we don't have a space that's easy for being able to make decisions about any of this, like there's no boss. A few years ago, people were going, oh, Indigenous leaders. And it's like, I mean, one of the things I love about Luke Pearson from Indigenous X is how much he's written against the idea that there are Indigenous leaders. I'm using air quotes. But, this notion of leadership that has been determined in the way that the media thinks it has, or even sometimes community thinks it has. So in community has leadership. But leadership is not, what you see on LinkedIn. It's not like a corporate leadership where, there's a risk assessment and the person at the top is in charge, and, it doesn't work like that. And I don't think that that's very well understood. And so decisions about support for people, decisions about the way that people find others, that are living in solidarity with them, I think is really complex and it can't be described. I know because my work is attempting to describe it quite often, and I realize I can't do it. It's not in service of it actually to try and nail it down. And it's very similar in a lot of ways to when people will say things like, were there trans people 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years? This is the work I do. And I say, of course, because we exist now. So using, ideas around Indigenous belonging, we would say, but I'd also say that thinking about Visner, Gerald Visner, who's an Anishinaabe scholar who talks about Indigenous survivance, frames this idea that if we exist now, we existed in the past and will exist in the future. It just doesn't make any sense for people to have just appeared, but trying to show evidence for things is a colonial structure.
Yes.
It's its own colonialities, and it's not the same as not being able to think about your own community and your own space back through that. This is very much about the idea that you're trying to look into a colonial archive and find people in some kind of a weird cop-like, interrogation. And it just doesn't make sense because language is different across time, because ways of understanding people are different. And so there's a lot of interest in this. And, I'm not very fond of when people go and try and find ancestors, for instance, from 300 or 400 years ago, because while it's interesting to think about gender in that way, we live in a different world, and all that happens is we're actually putting our own ideas onto people who are no longer alive. But by the same token, I have absolutely zero evidence that there were ever cis people 300 or 400 years ago, so it's not, this isn't, having a go at people who are framing that. It's kind of suggesting that you're buying into the same bad ideas when you go through and try and prove this notion of our existence. And, this comes up all the time, this idea that coloniality is what brought transness comes up all the time. And it's not true, but trying to trot out difference is nonsense. It is just unfair and its own problem. And, non-Indigenous people do it with Indigenous people all the time. We're constantly a proof of concept for trans people. Like trans non-Indigenous people will frequently draw us out and use us as an example. And I hate that. I think it's absolutely appalling. It's completely disconnected from community, and it's in service of them. It's helping them.
Yeah, we're not your example.
Yeah, exactly. We're not their example. So, there's a solidarity there that could be seen as busted if people want solidarity that doesn't have difference and disagreement. And and if people just say you can't talk about this, you have to just accept it and move forward with it, I think that's really hard. So I think you can be seen as someone, well, not you can be seen as someone, I can be seen as someone, because this is the work I do, who is divisive in that way. And I'm interrogating kind of the reason why we talk about people, but I think essentially you have to be kind with people. And like that kindness is about not making things up. That kindness is about not using people in service of other people who have more power.
And truth telling is kindness. It is. And it's speaking truth to power. So it's recognizing where the power is as well in that space. And so sometimes we have power. Like I think people will often say, do you feel powerless in that? Well, I'm a full professor at a university. Of course I don't. I've got a lot of power. I don't in some other ways, but that's what happens across our lives. We'll have power within our friend group sometimes. We'll have power within whatever power means. I think it means freedom, actually, in this instance. But the power that we speak truth to is really a power that's not defined in that way, like that we can't pull apart and understand. So I think, for instance, I have power as someone who's a professor within my university, but I don't have power over the university. I don't have power over the system that we sit in, and in a whole lot of ways, I also don't want that. I want to be able to interrogate that. So, and also, do you see similarities in the ways that colonial systems impact both First Nations people and trans communities?
Yeah, I think there are similarities, but I think this is because it's got nothing to do with trans communities, whether they're, Indigenous or not, or Indigenous communities, whether they're trans or not. It's got nothing to do with who we are. It's got to do with the systems. So the systems don't understand any group that doesn't have power. So they'll either try and find ways for that group to have power, or they'll find ways for it not to, and so it'll either become a group that is not supported. I really love the term that's used across Europe at the moment, underserved. It sounds a little bit like undeserved, but underserved. That idea of a community not being served well by the people who should be doing it is actually, I think, really powerful. I think it reminds us, we often talk about marginalisation, but margins are things that sit, between, again, if the colonial project of gender as containers, then actually, or the colonial project itself is containers, then actually what happens with those margins is that they're defining the container. And I don't love that, but I think this is the point, is that, yeah, of course, there are these, instances where the margins become a part of what's kind of known and understood, and it's understood as the margin. So yes, in that way, I think systems treat anybody who fits within this very tight understanding of what a community can be will be poorly served, in the underserved sense. It'll be really tricky. It'll be a space that's really hard to escape from, and it's hard to sit outside of. It's one of the reasons, for many, many times people will say to me, if I'm doing a keynote of some kind, I think especially before I started whinging about it, but people would say, are you going to talk about Indigenous stuff, or are you going to talk about trans stuff? And it's like, I'm probably talking about both, but also stop. Whatever you think fits within that framing. Is that I'd say Indigenous studies, as an example, is the study of everything. It's everyone's disciplines or our disciplines,
and also this concept, the whole concept of transness only exists out of the construct of gender, which was a colonial import.
It fully is, but it's also it's colonial, and it's not long lived as an idea. Now, it doesn't mean that, there's differences across this around sex and gender. I don't make those distinctions because they're weird distinctions that, belong in the land of she who should not be named. But they're distinctions that are really problematic as well, because they're distinctions that are meant to slice off communities. But all distinctions are, and that's the coloniality. So coloniality is not about gender, it's about what sits within that, because people have always had ideas about gender. They've just changed and they've shifted, and they're allowed to, because that's normal. But when you start to write something down in a ledger, it doesn't get to be able to be changed. And that's the coloniality. Coloniality is making a much more reduced way of being in the world, or knowing the world. That's what happens in colonisation. They go to a place and they are only interested in a small sliver of what's there. They're interested in the world, but they're interested in a small sliver of what's
cut me off this piece, because that's the piece I'll digest. I'm not going to eat the rest of the cake, sort of thing.
Indeed. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Selective. And I'm not even going to know that it exists. I'm not even going to, believe that that is important. And so when it comes to ledgers, as an example, I like the idea of ledgers because they were used, very substantially, particularly ships' logs, for instance, that kept track through that very strong 17th, 18th, 19th century kind of colonial turn. You saw this be the measure of who comes in, who's valued, how they're valued, and who doesn't sit in there, and what they bring, and then what they're meant to find peace with in, the colonized land. And so I sort of like the idea of that, because it's a physical, container, like it really does physically contain people. And of course, we have the same ledgers that are then built up around Indigenous people. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's so fascinating how narrow we can make humanity or human existence, really, isn't it? But what do we know about gender diversity historically within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures? Is there even the concept? Was it just like not even something that existed? Were people just people? How did this sort of play out? Was there an example of this?
No, there isn't. And people who are searching for this and trying to find it, I don't mean people will be able to find individuals, if they're in the last few hundred years, or they'll be able to find individuals if they're told it through their family stories. So I don't mean to deny that. I think those exist. But I think the searching for transness is its own problem, and searching for the way that we used to is part of the way that Aboriginal people and Indigenous people worldwide become historicized. So there's this notion that we lived in the past, but also that if we change, okay, say for a moment there were no Indigenous people, no trans people in Indigenous communities until, I don't know, let's say 60 years ago. Let's make it when I'm born, which makes no sense because there's plenty of trans people who are older than me, trans Indigenous people who are older than me. But let's say that it happened then. It doesn't mean that we're not Indigenous and trans and that it's not cultural. It doesn't mean that, it will be cultural. Cultural doesn't mean it's happened forever. And we've been really stuck in having to make that case as Indigenous people. We've had to make the case that the only thing that will be believed and understood is something that is thousands of years old. The only thing that, but I mean, this is its own nonsense. It just doesn't make sense. And, we have, one of the reasons that I often look at Europe and I look at the mechanisms of museums in Europe and the way that they gender objects from Europe is because historical objects, like deep history objects like Ice Age art, for instance, which is 34,000 years through to, contemporary era, or through to about 3,000, but largely 9,000 BCE. So I look at this like large chunk, it all gets gendered by people now. Like it's by people now. It's not gendered by people then. People will look at something like Venus of Willendorf, which some people listening to this might know. People will look at Venus of Willendorf and they'll see a figure that is a womanly figure or a female figure. They'll see that because that's what it writes, and they'll see that because that's what they've been trained to see, not because that's what the person who did it at the time thought. For a long time they saw these figures as maternal figures or a kind of idea of a birthing body or a body that's about to birth. Like contemporary renderings of Venus of Willendorf is not that. It's that it was probably a perspective work where she's looking down on herself, or they're looking down on themselves, or he's looking down on himself. And in that looking down, they see a rounded belly. So I'm always interested in Venus of Willendorf because Venus of Willendorf looks like me. I'm not a woman, so I often think, well, your renderings are what's making this figure womanly, but also it's another very anti-woman, specifically rendering that this had to be made by a man who was looking at a woman, so It had to be this external, women didn't make things, kind of notion, which makes no sense.
And it's also this like confirmation bias. We're using our thinking, our programming to insert that and layer that on top of something that we're finding and then confirming to ourselves, yes, this is a woman. Obviously, she couldn't do it herself. Therefore, it was a man. Therefore, that's what this is. Here's the label. Slap it in a museum. That's what it is.
Exactly. And so that's one of the reasons why I tend to kind of pull apart the idea of how we write about or know or understand, because like Aboriginal people are in the same boat as everyone else. Like a lot of the way that we'll know things is through our communities, but we'll also largely know a lot of the evidence that we're able to provide through the colonial record. And if the colonial record could only imagine, for instance, men and women whose body looked a certain way, then you better believe that's what's going to be there. And so, yes, there's examples of it. I almost don't want to, not almost, I don't trot them out myself. And one of the reasons that I don't is that it's what people will grab hold of and use as evidence instead of thinking about the broader issue of stop looking for evidence, And so I do look at this European work, for instance, Venus of Willendorf is like 30,000 years ago. So this is an unimaginable distance of time. And so what people do is when they see an unimaginable distance of time and they try and bring it into the now, they just assume that people don't have very complex ways of thinking about the world, because that's what we have now. We're complex now. We weren't complex then, is the rendering. But that's nonsense. That's just some idea that we're cleverer than people in the past, which is not, there's no evidence for it. Again, I always say with museums, you have no evidence for this. And people will often say, well, they're looking at female bodies. Well, they're using terms like woman and she. That's the thing, is that they're not just doing that. And what that says to a kid that goes into a museum is, I've just arrived. I haven't been here for a long time. This is not a story of me. And I worry about that with museums. It's one of the reasons that I look at museums, because kids are forced into going into museums. Like the rest of us, after we leave childhood, we can make choices about it. But this is often where people get trained up to consider the past, often briefly, but it's very brief and not very powerful or with agency if you're not seeing yourself represented.
It also lacks context, which is the thing, like if you're looking at something, an Indigenous piece of work in a colonial museum, it's lacking the literal environment, people, smell, sound, effects of literally everything in the moment that's supposed to encapsulate, which you can't do in a museum.
100%. And look, that's the work that we do, that we've been doing, that I've been doing with Handwritten Smith, and that we've been doing as a team for a really long time, is around museums, but it's also around who makes. And I did a museums project for about 10 years, up until 2017, that looked at 470 museums to look at their representation and engagement. I'm interested in museums because they're interesting spaces in a lot of ways, but they're also a little bit archaic. I don't mean their content, I mean the notion of people going to them. And so what keeps them current is something that I'm always really interested in. Like, what keeps people interested in going into them? And in that same way, what you were just saying about this idea of disconnection, is we see connection when, this is true across all of our work, whether it was me doing representations and engagements with museums of Indigenous communities, or whether it's our current work that's around queer engagement with museums that I'm working on with Alana Blakers and Han, is you end up with this same sort of problem, which is, why have it there in the first place? And what works in terms of an object or a way of understanding something, unsurprisingly, is when there's an Indigenous curator or a queer curator or a queer Indigenous curator. When you have somebody who has a responsibility to the community, I'm not talking about it as like a queer Indigenous person is just themselves. They don't represent everyone. But that idea of a responsibility back is actually really powerful, and was the main finding of the large ARC project. First one, the museums one, was if you have Indigenous curators, they don't disconnect objects from community. Yeah. So it basically remedies what you were talking about.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I like it, and this is why First Nations creators and curators are like so absolutely imperative when it comes to particularly so-called Australia storytelling and the storytelling of this continent.
I think it's true, but also I think it's about expertise across that area. Like, we think about it with the Queer Museums project, having someone who's queer or someone who's Indigenous, it's not a person. It's not a, in great big inverted commas, a lived experience, because the lived experience that one person has is nothing like the next person, and it shouldn't have to be. It should be someone who brings their expertise because of their connection to community, but grows that expertise as a responsibility to the community, not as a, as a reflection of it. I'm a Wiradjuri trans non-binary person, but I don't represent all Wiradjuri trans non-binary people. I know quite a few, and I don't represent them, and I can't. But it doesn't mean that I don't have a responsibility to them and that they're not going to get wild with me if I do something terrible. Now, if somebody gets wild with someone who's not connected to community, they can just move on. I can't move on, and I think that's what people don't understand, is that community has responsibilities, good ways. responsibilities.
Yeah, and we have responsibilities to each other, right? So,
Yeah.
and I think that is actually like a really very clear connection that both the trans community have and First Nations communities respectively too, because how I behave as a Two-Spirit Trua person impacts how Native Uruguayans are maybe perceived, because I'm representing a whole group of people. I'm on my own, and it's the same when I'm representing the trans community. When I'm in that space, is I'm putting on this hat of like, well, I now represent all of the trans masc or trans men spectrum here, and I've got to be mindful that what I say impacts my entire community. And
Yeah, except that also you can't be, like you
exactly.
can't be held responsible for it either in a big way, because you'll always get it wrong. Somebody will always be wild with you about stuff. But if someone's wild with you and they add to a conversation, that's no bad thing. So I think I do kind of challenge the idea that we're all part of a community. I think that's been terribly divisive. I think it's made people feel terrible about not being as connected as they should be or could be. I think it's I think for neurodivergent people, it's had a major, major impact on the idea of sort of participation as, as a central and important act.
Or
And
a validation as
or a
well.
validation, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny because this new project that I'm working on, or I'm planning, I shouldn't say I'm working on it, it's really in the early stages. I've been working on it for about a couple of years now, but it hasn't, my attention's been on on Queer which has an amazing podcast that Handwritten Smith has been leading, and that, has some really interesting content in it. But it actually led in some ways to this new project, which is one about older queer people. So it's not older Indigenous queer people, it's older queer people, and it's stories, and it's a bit more than stories, but it's around the idea of loneliness and isolation. And it's around what that means. And it comes out of a project that my late brother did, which was the book Bold, which some people might know, which came out in 2015, which was really the first edited volume that had stories, more than 50 stories from queer people, mostly across so-called Australia, with about 7, I think, Indigenous stories in it, including obviously my brother. And it was this really remarkable book because nobody had been talking about older queer people. I mean, older queer people had been. And within community organisations, there'd been a hiving off, but it hadn't been a kind of central discussion to kind of talk about that. And, one of the problems for older queer people is the same problem for younger queer people, and that is the people who are likely to be the voice are likely to be the people who are more present. They're the people who are showing up and participating in things, and we don't always represent everyone. There is a sort of an understanding that we might not represent everyone. But, what really came out of that remarkable book was a lot of stuff about what it is to be in aged care, what it is to be getting older and losing people around you. And for many of us my age, we went through that in the 80s with people who were our ages who were dying of AIDS. And the process of, I mean, that's also the case for the people who are older and the people who were writing into that book. So we had people who were coming to terms with having lived and coming to, so there were things that were unique, that are different for a community, but they're varied because that's not everyone, and they're varied because people who contributed, some of them were people who are not part of, the community, whatever that means,
Yeah. And that's so subjective, because what community means to someone means something, could mean something entirely different.
100%. Yeah. And communities are really, I mean, they're really funny because if I think about my community, it's made up of mostly cis people, but it's also made up of mostly, I don't, I've got a fairly large friend group, so I don't want to diss anyone, but if I think about, it's mostly older Aboriginal women my age, or a little younger, a little older, that is what it is. And some of the experiences impact them in the same way. When I think about what's the number one concern that older queer people have? Well, what's the number one concern that older people have in this country? Housing. Like what's the number one? Now, it doesn't mean it's a concern for everyone because some people got that sorted for whatever reason, or they've been lucky enough to, or whatever. But it keeps coming up as a major thing. And housing, we know from the very little reporting that's been done on this, we actually know that housing is one of the reasons, and the lack of housing is one of the reasons that people feel like they don't want to be here anymore.
Yeah. When you don't have when you feel like there's no place for you to belong, you don't belong. It's kind of a simple math. And
100%.
and also, like, what's the number one thing affecting queer people, trans people, First Nations people is the same that's affecting everyone, which is housing, but also disproportionately affecting us.
Yeah.
Because of this, again, the boxes that we fit in, the proximity to power, the closer you are to white, cis, heteronormativity, the more likely you are to succeed. And therefore, the further away that you are from that, the harder it becomes to operate within the system.
I think in disproportionately affecting some of us. This is because disproportionality is also relative, so it affects some people more than others. And so what happens is people can trot out exceptions, and at various different times in my life, I've been an exception. I'm sure you've been an exception too. We become these exceptions that are really unfair when it becomes about, people who are further underserved, and I think what we have to do is to understand how to do advocacy for people who are not ourselves. And again, I go back to my brother David's work that was very much focused on this. So what happened when he died in 2022 is that just a week before he died, we set up with him, this dignity fund, which was around looking at what dignity means. And it was around understanding what the implications of it are. So there is this sort of fantasy that if you could just get, for instance, queer housing that everybody could live in together. Now, not everyone wants that. So this notion of, oh, that's enough and you should just be, glad and feel like you're fully served and grateful becomes a part of that as well. And so I know that I sound like I'm just pulling out the problems of it, but actually we need to identify the problems of it.
No, we need to think about this stuff.
Yeah, we really do, rather than what often happens is it becomes people who have solutions that they want to fund, that they have community groups that they want to get funding for. And I understand that, but there is often members of the community who are not served by them. And it doesn't hurt us to be able to understand more about that. And part of that is hearing people's stories, is hearing what they have to say and looking at that. As a researcher, I don't just see that as it's a lovely story that I hope people hear. I see it as evidence as well, as long as the person who's saying it wants it to be. And of course, they have the right to kind of talk about how they want it to be evidence or not, how it sits outside of or sits within something that they observe with others. And I think that's really crucial. I'm excited about doing this. And I think part of it is because I'm about to turn 60. I am an older, Aboriginal person, and I'm certainly an older Aboriginal trans person. And I don't think that means a different thing. I think it means that I've been around for a really long time. And I think it means that I have some responsibilities that operate a little differently to other people.
Yeah, and I think also there's a responsibility to hear so many stories, hear so many perspectives, because it's through all these stories and perspectives that we come to the understanding of how we can actually support each other as individuals, how we can all live together on this earth, and what that looks like. I do have another question for you around solidarity and allyship. So what do you... I'm trying to think of the best way to...
No, go ahead. I kind of write for and against. I definitely write against allyship. Solidarity is different, but people often don't know what it means.
Yes,
even people who talk about it, like me.
Yeah, can you share an example where you've seen strong solidarity or community care within the communities that we're part of?
Yeah, I think solidarity is supporting people when you don't fully agree with them. I think solidarity is that, because requiring alignment on beliefs is deeply problematic in a whole lot of ways. I know now that solidarity for me looks very different than it looked 20 years ago. I think 20 years ago I was probably I was probably doing that thing of saying, I just need people to agree with me about something. I would never have said that, but I did think it. And, if you don't agree with me, then, bugger off.
Yeah, then go away.
Yeah, exactly. And that was very much a part of it, because I think that's what happens when we develop a kind of skin of hoping that people will accept and support us, is to go, okay, if you don't, then blah, blah, blah. But solidarities can exist in multiple different ways. Allyship I have much more of a problem with, just because oftentimes when it's used as a term, it's kind of a code for people not being terrible. It's actually, oh, you're allies. Oh, that's great. It's, I know it's used in workplaces quite often. And when I've seen it used in workplaces, including my own, it's like, okay, you're following the policies, because if you're following the policies, you're an ally. The only thing that's required within a workplace is that you comply with certain
The bar
things.
is too low, guys.
Yeah, the bar is way
Yeah.
too low, and also it puts the power on the ally, and it puts the responsibility on them to kind of tell another person's story. Whereas solidarity allows people to come forward as their own selves, and I think solidarity in particular is a really difficult idea, and it works until it doesn't. It works until the solidarity kind of falls apart because people stop agreeing enough that all that they're doing is getting together to try to agree on something. And so I think solidarity with individuals or with an action that's happening is better to understand. So I think that idea of solidarity, for instance, with what's happening in Queensland at the moment, has actions, with failing to provide access to puberty blockers for young people and other gender affirming care. I think it's specific. I think it's really good. I think it, really helps, but it can't be done by coming at it with your own position. You essentially have to look around and see and try and, so you're still being a bit selective about how you're supporting it. And I think we have to understand that solidarity is not solid. It's not. It still breaks away in parts, because lots of people would go, in that case with Queensland, they'd say, right, I'm going to support OzPath, who are providing mechanisms to, continue that care, but also doing some work to challenge. I'm going to go with any of the organisation Open Doors or any of the organisations that are doing challenges to this. Of course, I'm going to go with, Transcend's work. I'm going to, so all of those things are good, but I think also feeling those things is really important. And part of what we've done, I think, with this idea of solidarity is that we've pushed the idea that we all have to agree before we can move it forward. And that's something that I worry about with the term solidarity being trotted out. I think how you feel about it is quite different, and how, you can ask for support. I like support, even though it's like, it's a bit of a dirty word in a lot of ways, but I think, I think we want to be able to support people who need support. And it needs to be on their terms, not on ours, which is, I still think it's really a struggle for people. And I'm just going to say it, I think it's a struggle for older people my age, more than it is for others. I think we're very contingent on agreeing with people to provide that support. And I'm talking, I'm left. So I'm talking about people who have traditionally been left. I'm calling out bad actors in that probably see themselves as the best actors. I think we just have to examine it within ourselves. I do it from time to time, and I think, oh, what on earth?
Yeah.
Like, stop. And you have to be able to examine your own role in trying to force solidarity to align with your values.
And this could also come down to, like, when we think about ourselves and solidarity, I think about my position against something else. Whereas really what I try to do is go, well, what do I think is just, and what do I think is right? And then, is this my place to say something? Do I need to be standing behind someone has a more experience with this particular topic or area of activism? Or should I be standing at the front? Where should I be standing and looking at it from my own internal perspective, do you think?
100%. And
yeah.
I think we get pushed up into this. I think for queer people, maybe a little bit differently than for Indigenous people, though. So there was this very I'm going to speak against memoir, So the notion of memoir as if you've got a memoir, if you've got somebody telling their story, you can live your life that way. Like you can read that book and, you can see how someone's overcome or how someone hasn't. You can read how someone has worked through, but you're reading to some extent, well, you're reading a singular story for a start. This notion of the queer story, oh, I've got a story to tell, I'm going to write a book and you're going to read it, is great until someone reads that book and goes, but I can't succeed like that. I'm a terrible person because I could have done what that person did. And I often think about, there's one book that I won't mention the name of it, but it's a very, it's not from this continent. It's from Turtle Island, but it's a book that has been really banned and is really loved. And it's absolutely about a trans person who kind of has 99% of things going right for them. And I think a young person reads that book, well, it's genderqueer, I might as well say, but someone reads that book, it's a great book. But if you think this is the book that you want to give someone so that they can work out how genderqueer people should be treated, or for a genderqueer person, that it's not it. It can't work that way, but that's what we've been told. This lived experience, hear it from a trans person story is there. And it's deeply worrying because it doesn't connect us, and because it will always tell a memoir story, which is selective. And, it will always do that work. And so I write against it a fair bit. I write against, as you probably read in the piece that Hannah and I did on trans joy, I write against the notion of joy and pride, as these, like, let's have trans joy. I mean, God, or let's have pride. And it's like, I think what you're trying to do is to challenge the equal opposite that people want us to have, which is no joy and no pride. And I understand it, but also it's a bit much. Like, we shouldn't have to trot out our joy when we wake up every morning and have a cup of coffee. We shouldn't have to be doing that. We should be allowed to be our full selves.
Yeah, and also I have trans rage.
Yeah, and trans everything else, this is the thing, is that it doesn't get really very well understood, because we turn ourselves sometimes, but we're also pushed through solidarity, into this idea of having to inhabit particular moments. And trans joy is one of those ones where, sorry, every time I read trans joy, I just roll my eyes, because I think, okay, good on you. Go with God, whatever, but I mean, this is, it's too much of an insistence. And, I lived through a time where I didn't feel like I had to justify myself to other people. And I did feel like I had to justify myself to other people, but both those things were competing issues. But you don't solve it by justifying yourself to other people or to yourself. Instead, I know that this is like, feel the confidence. I don't know, that idea of if you are confident enough, you will blah blah blah. But they're tricky in a lot of ways. We should be able to be really boring. We should be able to be so boring that we can't write a memoir.
Yeah. We should just be just your existence is enough. Our existence is enough. I do have a sort of a final thoughts. Moving forward, or looking forward into the future, what gives you hope for the future of like First Nations communities, trans communities, people who use those labels maybe, and like what's a future look like to you, Professor?
I think one of the things that I love about Professor Chelsea Watego is not the fuck hope. It's the way that Chelsea says that, and people will push to that and go, oh, but actually Aboriginal people say fuck hope, or Chelsea says fuck hope. That's not actually what she says. What she says is hope is ours, and the idea of hope as a not acting on something, so in a lot of ways, I don't know what the future holds because I don't live in it. And I think that's right. Like, we don't know what the world is going to look like in a month's time, let alone 5 years' time, let alone tomorrow. And so we have to be able to be responsive. And to that end, I think there's like really complex discussions that we have to be able to have with one another. I'm writing the last chapter in the book at the moment. It's not the final chapter, but which is kind of a little bit of an ironic here, but it's the last chapter that I'm writing in this, and it's on death and dying, and it's also on suicide. And a lot of what I'm talking about is people's right. Now, we don't talk about this very much. We don't. We just don't. We have a narrative of stopping things, of stopping conversations. I don't mean just of stopping suicide. I mean of stopping conversations on death or tying them to something else. There's a lot of this that we just simply don't write or think about, or that is not right to. I hope that in the future, complex discussions can be things that we have, and that we don't have to agree with one another on it to be able to. I'm not talking about people who are bad actors who are like trouncing on someone's right. I'm talking quite the opposite. I'm talking about the idea that people have these rights to really expand their way of thinking. And I think we've been really overly cautious about what that means because we're worried that people think we're monsters. And I think that's true about Indigenous people, and I think that's true about trans people and other queer people as well. So, you know, I think that is a shared thing, is that you get people who are in that space of appeasing, and that's actually what Professor Watego was talking about. You know, so this notion of, I hope in the future we have, and then like a laundry list of things that you hope you have. I mean, I do that with the shopping, and I still come back with something else. You know, so
and you've still forgotten things.
Yeah, exactly. Even though they're on the list, and so I'm sure this is true in an unimagined and unimaginable time.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if we can all operate from a place of abundance and as opposed to, you know, a place of deficit, because in actual fact, I think all people, we all have power. We all have our own power, but, you know, we've been led under this illusion that power is elsewhere and we have to attain it. But in actual fact, we are power.
As I think abundance is a really interesting idea too, you know, and I think that because not just coloniality, but you know, the idea of abundance and a lack has been, you know, the colonial project too. But I think a reclamation of ideas of abundance is really important, where it doesn't just become about a zero-sum game, you know, which is what we live at the moment. I mean, this is, you know, the corporate world is you amortized from this to this, or you grow based on compounding wealth. And, you know, so I think the notion of what you need becomes really important in that idea of abundance. So yeah, couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much, Professor Sandy O'Sullivan, for taking the time to chat with me today. I feel so thrilled to have had this conversation with you. Same here. It always, you know, I'm writing at the moment, and this just helps me write and think, and amazing. I very much look forward to having you back to talk about more of what you write as well. Fantastic.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast exclusive episode of Tranzmission this week, and a special shout out again to Professor Sandy O'Sullivan. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. I very much look forward to having you back, so stay tuned to Tranzmission and 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. Don't forget to support the station by subscribing to 4ZZZ. You can head to the website 4ZZZ.org.au /support. There are a myriad of different subscription packages. All of them are annual, of course, so you don't have to worry about monthly subscriptions, as well as ways to volunteer. If you are thinking about maybe you would like to be a radio announcer or on our podcast, you can also do that by subscribing to the station. There is a page on the 4ZZZ website, 4ZZZ.org.au, where you can actually volunteer and get involved. You could be on reception. You could hang out at a gig and go to live music. You could also work in our music department, uploading music and hearing the cool sounds of Brisbane and beyond. You could also start your own show. It doesn't have to be a trans show. It could be any show at all. Why don't you do that? Head to 4ZZZ.org.au. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks for listening to Tranzmission. Catch us every Monday live on 4ZZZ from 10 a.m. or listen to our podcast on the Community Radio Plus app.